call it $52 billion. I got all mad. I'm like, I'm going to call Marshall. We're going to do commercial. And I stopped for a minute and I said, you know what? I'm the asshole who's being served by that. And I don't mean this in a self-flagellating, privileged way. Like, let me take a peek into my 401k. Guess what stocks I'm probably holding, right? A ton of airline stock. So when there's a stock buyback, which I can get angry about, part of the thing is to have a realization and go, look, that's a really
good example, because it shows that's a good, what would you say? That sheds an interesting light on the implacability of the Pareto distribution. It's like you're part of the problem, even though you object to it ideologically, and you're part of the problem because of where you sit in the economic structure. And
right, but the thing is about this, and you talk about regulation or policies not working, which I want to return to in a minute, but part of what I realized was that's not because I'm a good investor. That's not because I'm smart. That's not free market.
It's not because you're cruel and malevolent either.
No, it's not. But this is not my investing genius or the free market at work, right? We don't have a transfer of wealth of that extent going the other direction. And so part of it is like, okay, so I'm a beneficiary. So what a solution for a lot of things is, you know, you give money, you scream about privilege, and you self-flagellate. As far as I'm concerned, that's all a it's a self-focused reaction, as opposed to me saying, how do we start to address that problem? And the thing is it has to be partially policy, partially regulation. We can no longer.
Well, it is something that we fight all the time. You know, one of the things you just said shed light, I think, again, for me on my irritation with the left end of the ideological spectrum, is that it's just too much to see people who benefit, say, like, who are in a position like you are, or like I am in, because we're net beneficiaries of the Pareto distribution in a major way. Now, it seems to me too much for me to also expect to be admired as a paragon of virtue in relationship to my attitude towards the poor, let's say. Because then I'm asking for too much. I'm asking to be a beneficiary of the system the way it's set up now. And I'm asking to be admired for my objection to the very system that is enriching me. And the second one of those is too much to ask for.
And the solution for that, and like when I had that realization, I was like, let me get on that. Let me look at policies. Let's have an economic summit like the one you and I did. Like, and I'm not claiming I'm going to like go out and fix the whole problem, but if all I do is sit around and go, oh, I feel so guilty, let me do a couple think pieces about it and talk about white privilege. It's just more self-focused bullshit for those people who think about politics 4 minutes a week, because they can only afford to think about politics for 4 minutes a week. So what do we do? And what I do is I try to advocate for, you know, policies that will work, even if some of those are conservative policies, right? I mean, I have a ton of people across the aisle, across the whole spectrum, who I'd reach out to, go, what do you think of this? Are there libertarian answers? There's got to be some regulatory answers, because it's so out of control.
Well, hopefully, because the end of the Pareto game is that far too few people have far too much of everything, and that's not even good for them. I mean, you're not rich if you have to live in a gated community.
That's right.
That's a gilded cage. You know, it's not an indication of wealth. Wealth is when you can walk around your city freely at night. That's wealth.
That's exactly it. And so that's so much of what we arrived at in the messaging when we try to talk to people across the aisle, country club Republicans, let's say. There's a difference for me for people who are at the wrong end of this system. And it pisses me off when people get so angry about the fact that like all these people are voting in ways that hurt their own interests, right?
Yeah.
And I always say, like, I vote in ways that hurt my own interests. I don't just vote. Like, how do you know what their interests are? Their interests could be moral. Their interests could be familial. Their interests could be religious. It's not just their financial interests, first of all.
Yeah, their interest could be their children's future rather than their own current reality. I mean, I learned a long time ago that small businessmen didn't vote for socialist policies in Canada, even when they were pro small business, because they didn't want to be small businessmen. They wanted to be big businessmen. So they were voting their dream, not their reality. And it's not obvious that that's a mistake, even though, well, you could criticize it and you could point out its lacks, but it doesn't mean its inadequacies, but that doesn't mean that it's a mistake.
So let's get into the canary in the coal mine discussion again. So I think, like, for me, it's glaringly apparent, and I know lots of people, especially a good number of the people who are your listeners, will in good faith disagree with me on that. To me, it's glaringly apparent the difference in terms of what a Trump presidency, let's say, and a Biden presidency, in terms of the relative levels of corruption and undermining of the democratic norms. I know there's a lot of counter arguments. I'm happy to have all of those. But for the sake of this discussion, from my perspective, it's this big slice here, like of a totem pole. The vast majority of Americans are so far down. They're so far down below that when they're looking up, they can't possibly distinguish some subtle, well, you see Trump, it's an emoluments clause, and he's doing fundraisers on the South Lawn of the White House, and that's unacceptable. But the kind of fundraising and enrichment that the Clintons did was different for this other, they can't differentiate that. So for me, and so then that gets to the question of, was the vote for Trump, like my friend who went in that booth and said, forget it, I don't care. Was that a wiser thing because that's a higher disagreeable irritation structure before we get somebody who's even more threatening from the right?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's certainly possible.
Is the Trump presidency, there's no way now that we can move forward, I think, without having much more robust and angry dialogue about that $50 trillion movement from the bottom 90 to the top 1%. Right. And there's some race conversations beyond I believe that the surface stuff that we distract ourselves with all the time, like cultural appropriation. There's all these issues. And there's
I've often thought, and I'm interrupting you partly because this is such a crucial point, that distribution of wealth problem. I've come to believe that even though the left focuses on that as the primary problem, they actually don't focus on it enough because the attribution of the problem is wrong. I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that the Pareto distribution is a secondary consequence of the capitalist system. So what that means to me is that the left-wingers aren't actually taking the problem of relative poverty seriously enough because they've got a handful of stock answers that have been applied with absolutely no success whatsoever. And in their more radical guises, they're not looking at the problem with enough seriousness, but the problem exists. And it doesn't exist too because people are malevolent or greedy, although that might add to it. It's much more complex problem than that, and one that's